This session is recorded, and welcome to all of you to our supportive housing supervisors learning community. And for those who are new to our learning community, welcome. And for those who are returnees, I appreciate you joining us and look forward to having a meaningful engagement today about a subject that I'm sure, given the feedback we've received, is of significant interest to you in terms of really taking a conscientious look at the best practices for supporting older adults with severe mental illness. As you know, and you will get further information related to that, population in the United States is growing older rapidly. So we're also seeing a number of the folks that we serve aging in place and certainly requiring a real nuanced view and approach to services. And we have to dedicate time, energy, and some training and skills development to ensure that we're providing the best quality of care for that particular growing and evolving population. Hence, the reason for our commitment to that subject today. For those who are new, I am Earl Leach. I am a senior training and consultations specialist with Rutgers University School of Health Professions. We are contracted by the Washington State DBR to conduct these learning communities and training as part of their ever-evolving and growing training consortium. So welcome. Today's meeting is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority, and this is an interactive meeting. We hope to ask questions and really get your participation. Please note that the slides and recording will be sent to you via email after the presentation. It will be sent by representative of the Washington State Healthcare Authority, so look out for those in your email. It'll come with the email that you registered particularly for this training. Good afternoon to you, Daniel, and good afternoon to you all. So let's get through our quick housekeeping. Obviously, this is webinar mode, so you use the chat or raise your hand, and you can try to unmute you for you to respond, but we prefer certainly to respond via the chat. The information for audio is there for folks who may not have that audio option or maybe struggling with their video. You can use the audio information that are presented in the chat to access us via audio. What's our learning objectives for today? What we hope that you have as a takeaway from today's session. We want to examine the state of mental health for older adults in America, what the statistics say and what it really looks like in terms of the picture of mental health for older adults in America. We certainly want to identify how ageism, bias, and stereotypes about aging and serious mental illness can limit valued life roles, opportunities for older adults in America, and we'll really discuss what valued life roles are and why they're so important in the life and well-being of older adults. We want to take a look at and to outline strategies for really practicing and implementing best practices in supporting older adults with serious mental illness. So, the aging process. I mean, there's so much that is discussed and oftentimes projected about what the aging process really is. And more often than not, the more we look at it conscientiously, the more we see additional descriptors and defining characteristics of the entire aging process. But for this particular purpose, and just in general, the National Institute of Health on Aging opined and reported that aging is really associated with dynamic biological, physiological, environmental, psychological, behavioral, and social changes. So changes in all dimensions of wellness, all dimensions of one's life is really impacted by aging. Even though some age-related changes are benign, for example, losing your hair or graying hair or other such phenotypical kind of changes or physiological changes, Other changes can result in decline in functioning of the senses and activities of daily living that really increase susceptibility and frailty or disability, particularly for those who are growing ever older. In many regards, advanced age is a major risk factor for several chronic diseases in humans. So there are a great deal of significant changes that impact functioning and certainly put older adults at greater risk of developing chronic illnesses and other such challenges. But there's also some really positive elements to aging, as we'll know, right? You know, there's a level of wisdom and resilience and knowledge that you bring to the table. So from a scientific standpoint, when we talk about the aging process, we're talking about the impact of molecular and cellular damage over time. As you know, our body certainly changes and deteriorates as we age. What is important to note is that aging is not defined simply by the number of years a person has lived. There's a greater deal than just that age on your birth certificate that indicates whether or not you're at that stage of your life where you're actually experiencing age-related challenges or age-related concerns. As we know, a great deal of the population that we serve as serious mental illness are aging a lot more rapidly than is typical. And we'll talk some more about that as well. So there are metabolic changes, there are changes that occur in all systems of the body. What is important to note is that the changes are not linear or consistent, right? They vary based on a lot of factors and personalities, and they're impacted by many things. So there's increase, obviously, as you age. What you find is that you lose a lot of loved ones or significant people in your life, and grief and loss is really a significant element of older adulthood. What I want to take a look at is there are some realities and expectations and some variances in how we really look at aging. And it's important for us to take into consideration. And the Pew Research Center of Social and Demographic Trends did a survey and really came up with some very significant findings. What was found is that there was a major gap between the expectations that young or middle-aged people have about aging and the actual experiences reported by older Americans themselves. Does that make sense? That there is a deviation, actually a variance, in what is presumed about people that are older and what's actually in reality, what's actually the experiences of older people. Has that been an experience of yours, or have you heard of that particular experience in terms of really a deviation or a variance in the perceptions and reality about aging? Has that been an experience that you've had? So feel free to share your feedbacks in the chat, and share your experiences in the chat. So what was actually indicative in this particular research is that a lot of the variances or the disparity in that kind of feedback came when certain questions were asked. So they were very particular to certain questions. Daniel says, I never thought about that. What makes someone seem old? But the list is pretty vast. Absolutely. The list is particularly significant. There's lots of people who believe people only become old when they turn 85. Yet Social Security disability or Social Security may have a different age, right? 65. Pretty soon for folks in my generation will realize that when we become eligible for Social Security at 67, that's how we're going to be presumed to be old. In a sense that we get those benefits that are associated with old age. There's a presumption among people that, you know, old folks when people turn 75, or they may be different numerical marker or age-related marker. Sometimes it is when someone finds their health ailing, or things change in their health, or retirement, or other aspects of that vary. So what came out of that research is that in every instance when we look at this variance, older adults reporting experiencing a lower level, or often a far lower level in many regards, related to these outcomes than is expected by younger folks. That really speaks to the fact that that's now how a number of older people really gauge and measure where they are in terms of their process and how they see themselves as being older Americans, not necessarily by those distinctions. So that's important to note when we project sometimes our perception of what being an older American is and how it may be received by people who are in that particular category. It's important to make sure that we're being thoughtful and nuanced in our communication around what is perceived to be older. Daniel says, I can share a testimony I experienced many years ago. At the beginning, I remember when I was 6 years old and I met a 13-year-old. I said to him, whoa, you are old. Absolutely. In my experience, I have, my daughter and nieces who believe that by the time you hit 40, you're old. And in today's society, oftentimes, when you're at a certain age, and if you're not technologically advanced or with the times, your responses or behavior could be presumed that of an old person because you're out of touch with what's happening. So that in itself is a new way of defining old or young. So there's lots of evolving distinctions. So when we speak particularly of aging in America, what's important to note in terms of the statistics and those distinctions is, as a nation, we are aging rapid. Older adults are becoming more of a prominent category of our population. 16.8% of folks in America are age 65 years and older. In 2020, about 1 in 6 people in the United States were age 65 and over. And that's really been a novelty. That has never been as far as I know, the primary existence of this nation. The number of Americans age 65 and older have increased by 25% from 2003 to 2013. And the next 25 years promise another 50% increase. So think of it. In the next 50 years, the percentage of older Americans are going to be beyond 33%, 1/3 of the population. Think of the ramifications of that. That's an interesting perspective. That's an interesting perspective, Daniel. She says, no one is really getting old. We're at different stages of aging, right? Absolutely. Old is really personalized in a perception as opposed to a distinction, right? It's all about perspective. So what we're noticing is that as a nation, we're aging 5 times faster than the total population. The aging population is aging 5 times faster than the total population. The folks above 65 is actually aging 5 times above the regular population. So it's significant that we have to really be able to prepare and be ready to serve an older population in a sustained, knowledgeable way. We can't continue to do what we were doing and assume that it's just going to automatically apply to people who have different needs as their life changes. And we look at a graph here of the population size of older age Americans. What was profoundly shocking to me is that I never knew until I did this research that Americans aged 85 to 94 actually 5.7%. Think of this nation having about 20%, above 20% of people aged 85 to 94. There was a time in this country where getting to 60 was an achievement. Now, not only are we living longer, but we are living more purposefully, meaningfully, and desire to have a more fulfilling life long after 70. So we have to not only prepare, we have to be ready to effectively support and assist our older population as they continue to live, not just survive, but continue to live and thrive in our community. Hence the focus of how are we going to do this and how are we going to do it well. The National Institute on Aging had a strategic direction for research. It had this conference that took place recently that was of significance, great significance in terms of the findings. Because what they really established is that there are some clear and definitive goals that have to be achieved in order for us to be ready and prepared to effectively serve our older population. First and foremost, they speak to us a need for a better understanding of the biology of aging and its impact on prevention, progress, progression, and prognosis of disease and disability. So there's a greater need for that. That's a goal that we have to strive for, to better understand the biological elements of disease prevention, progression, and prognosis. We have to also have a better understanding of the effects of personal and interpersonal and societal factors on aging. What is in our society that impacts aging and impacts how people age and the success of aging? We have a need to develop effective interventions to maintain health, well-being, and function, and prevent or reduce the burden of age-related diseases, disorders, and disability. So there was a time when illness prevention and the focus on that was not associated with older folks, because there was a concept that people are old, they don't, they're not going to live long enough to invest in preventative measures around diseases because the disease is going to, essentially be their demise. That is not the case now, given that people are living way beyond 55 or 60. We have to develop a better understanding of the aging brain to address Alzheimer's disease, related dementias, and other neurodegenerative disease. So there's lots of aspirational goals that we have to achieve and practical goals that needs to be achieved in order for us to be a more versed and prepared and effective society at serving a very significant and robust population that we have. So I know I am inundating you with a lot of information around the process of aging, but we'll get to what we can do in short order. So what exactly is the state of mental health of older adults? Let's just, shift from the whole aging process and getting old to really look at a segment, that mental health element of the aging process. What we've learned is at least 1 in 4 older adults experiences some mental disorder, such as depression, anxiety, or dementia. Scary. 1 in 4 experiences some significant emotional and psychological disorder or challenge that can impact their functioning for an extended and sustained period. As a matter of fact, more than 17% of the years lived is with disability for some folks. What's also important to note is folks over 85 have the highest rate of any age group as it relates to suicide. and self-harm. There is a higher rate of SMI and substance use disorder for homeless folks that are older in long-term care facilities and in prisons. So these are startling but revealing statistics. 2/3 of seniors with mental health problems do not get the treatment they need. As a matter of fact, they're considered to be in that treatment gap. And ultimately, what we've learned is that mental health services for older adults are limited, extremely limited in our country, really putting people further at greater risk outside of their scope and control. So these are just some reality-based statistics that put in frame the real daunting picture of mental health, the state of mental health in America. And I appreciate that feedback, Ashley. But Ashley says she sees regularly with folks who have Medicare have limited service options for mental health. Absolutely. And even if they have the options, it is not necessarily common that they may be able to access it, whether by capacity, functionality, or simply by how it is delivered. It may not be in keeping with how they can access it. So it's important to take a look at that and the systems in that regard. So ultimately, the question is then, why should we really care about the mental health of older adults? Can we just ignore it and go on like it will be what will be, will be? Yes, Daniel, this is a level of fright that can be derived from this information, but there is a viable way of addressing it and dealing with it conscientiously, concretely, and sustainably. Daisy says you're not able to see everything in the chat. Let's see if I can address that, because everyone should have the opportunity to. Yes, it's set to where everyone can actually chat. Okay, fair enough. Fantastic. I'm glad you're able to address that. So let's figure out, why is this important? Obviously, we just spoke about the rapid aging America. So it's not as though it's an avoidable or something that we can ignore. It's happening, it's coming, it's only going to get even more prominent. Mental illness among older adults in America is the leading cause of suffering and disability, not only in America, but in the world. Just think of that for a moment. Not any medical issue, not starvation. Mental illness is actually the cause of the greatest suffering and disability in the world among older folks with mental illness. Profound. What we've also gathered is that given this information, in actuality, there's an unprecedented opportunity for societal growth. Because what we've learned is that our ability or capability of enhancing the mental and behavioral health of older adults actually can maximize the well-being and contributions of all of us as we age. Because the one thing we can guarantee as Homo sapiens, as human beings, is what? We will all get old. None of us can stay perpetually young, regardless of what all the song says. We will grow old. It's a guarantee that's going to happen. So we have to hope, and not hope, but act in a way that prepares us for that juncture in our lives. What we've also learned is that there's a high prevalence of mental health conditions and substance use disorder among older adults with mental illness. It's actually a great disparity in the number. And Daniel, I can hear that when we speak of the resources to treat mental health issues may be available, but providing that the people with are compliant. The reality is sometimes compliant also is not just about compliance. We have to also be able to actually deliver the service and provide the right service at the right time to the right person in a thoughtful, compassionate, quality way. It's beyond just compliance. But I understand what you're saying. Ultimately, if people are not engaged, the treatment, as phenomenal as it is not going to have a difference if we don't get people actively engaged in adherence and participation in it. There is obviously a disproportionate impact on suicide. Older adults with mental illness have a higher rate of suicide than most other age categories and groups. There is a profound impact on physical health as a consequence of mental illness among older adults. And as we already know, older adults are prone to, are subject to, are doomed to more significant health issues, chronic health issues, and that is compounded oftentimes by mental illness that is untreated or improperly treated. So it puts it at even greater risk of total collapse of the of that whole person's functioning when it's actually compounded by mental illness. What we've learned over time is that mental illness is concomitant with a shortening of the life span. People with severe and persistent mental illness oftentimes die 20 to 25 years earlier than the average person without a mental illness. So it's important to note that. And there is significant evidence of inadequate access to appropriate treatment, hence exacerbating conditions of mental health conditions that are already affecting people's functioning. There's a level of inequity in terms of the access to mental health, and we spoke about that. You know, there's lots of services that are not available to people with Medicare, or oftentimes a great deal of our older population may not have the economic capacity to actually compete in the market for services. So there's a lot of challenges in that regard. What is also significant across all human service stuff, but particularly in the geriatric mental health workforce, is that there's an impending crisis. As a matter of fact, it's not an impending crisis anymore. There is a crisis. We simply don't have enough trained people who are trained in geriatric mental health to actually provide the services that we need to provide. So there is a myriad of challenges that are already facing the treatment services, and if we don't get on top of it, it's going to collapse further. So that's why we should really care about it and do something about it, because there's lots of reasons why the impact can be devastating if not addressed. And not just devastating to older people, because if all the folks in our society are impacted, they impact the overall population in general, because of this substantial number that they are and their role and impact across all other areas of the population. And for those who may be old enough to be caregivers or primary sources of support for their older parents, you imagine if those services are not there, it exacerbates your role and therefore takes away from one aspect of your life, makes it even more demanding for you. There is a major significance of depression among older adults with mental illness. What is important to note is that there is a misnomer that the prevalence of depression or depressive syndrome actually is somehow concomitant with aging. As people grow older, they just get depressed. That is not true. It is not accurate. It's not supported by the science. In 80% of cases of older people with depression, it is a treatable condition. You're not doomed to death and a life associated with depression simply because you're an older adult. As we know, depression can be very debilitating. Impairments in physical, mental, and social functioning can be the result. It also serves oftentimes to compound and undermine other treatments for other chronic illnesses. And what we find among older adults, depression is widely under-recognized, untreated, or undertreated. And for a number of reasons. Oftentimes it may not be reported, it may not be actually screened for. There may be presumptions that, matter of fact, there's a fact that a number of older adults only access primary health care, and therefore it may actually mirror other symptomology of other chronic illnesses, medical illnesses, are not recognized as a freestanding or substantial mental illness and thus treated in that way. So there's lots of reasons why there is a lot of misconnect with depression among older adults. What we find is also implicated in a number of cases of suicide. The underlying factor for a number of suicide attempts or successful suicide among older adults, depression seems to be the underlying cause. So there's a significant focus on that. And that's an important observation. That mental health diagnosis can stem off of just depression alone. Oftentimes, the depression may have other social determinants, or it can be more of a result of a lot of other stressors. Or oftentimes, depression can result, or depressive episodes can result as a consequence of chronic medical illnesses not being managed enough to actually help that person feel whole and purposeful and meaningful in their lives. Isolation, lots of other factors can impact depression in older adults. So there's a relationship between behavioral and physical health, particularly for older adults. What we find is that physical health conditions presenting as behavioral health concerns and cognitive impairments. So you have to be very careful with diagnostic criteria and really looking at screening, because oftentimes older adults are already presenting with multiple conditions, and it's easy for it to be understated or not effectively screened out to really look at it as significant in its own right. Behavioral health conditions sometimes can present as physical conditions and cognitive impairments. All right, as we know, many people, particularly older folks with depression or anxiety, can really present more somatic in that sense. They can report more somatic symptoms, belly aches, headaches, and that's the way they see best to describe what they're experiencing, because they don't have that ability to necessarily, or willingness to really look at it removed from those other conditions. It may be very difficult to do so. Medication side effects presenting as symptoms of other illnesses. Side effects of some medical condition, medication for medical conditions can actually present or create side effects that are more psychological or psychoactive in nature. And there may be a mixture of that comorbid situation where you have depression occurring without a physical mental health. So in essence, really screening, diagnosing, and really looking at the full picture of the health of an older adult is a challenging one and requires particular attention and skill and nuance. There are some key distinctions in older adults. They already present with chronic health conditions. Drug and alcohol use is oftentimes hidden among that, and it may be self-medicating or even just doing so for recreation. You know, I spoke to one of my colleagues, and, you know, he was surprised that one of the consumers he was serving actually was actively using illicit substances because he just didn't associate it with an older person. Why would they be out there, you know, buying marijuana? That just doesn't seem to compute with an older person. But you can't ignore it or deny it or actually put your head in the sand. There's a reality to that. There's safety concerns, elder abuse. So there's lots of things that you have to look at when you're really looking at the full scope and the picture of someone who's an older adult with serious mental illness. Lots of other variables that are presenting simultaneously. And we often have to look at the negative attitudes and discrimination that actually is oftentimes pointed directly at older adults. And that certainly can impact the picture, can make it very cloudy. What we also know is that a lot of older adults with serious medical conditions are commonly prescribed medications. Oftentimes pain medication and opioids for pain and benzodiazepines to use to treat anxiety and sleep disorder are very addictive substances and increase the risk of abuse and misuse in older adults. So it requires a tremendous amount of thoughtful, guided expert screening and asking the right questions in the right time to get information that really helps to clarify the picture. So we look at the social determinant because as we know, mental illness in older adults is not necessarily a one-track road. It doesn't really is not caused by a single element. There are a number of determinants that impact. So let's look at some of the social determinants of mental health in older adults. As we know, generally, there's social determinants of health in the general population. Economic stability, healthcare access, housing, those are generally known. But when we are looking specifically at older adults with mental illness, we can look and we should look at some unique social determinants. Stigma and ageism is a significant determinant for older adults. How they're perceived, how they're treated, how they see themselves can impact their sense of wellness and health. Care and service and treatment disparity, significant. Older adults get, in many instances, providers and practitioners may not see them as good historians or may not consider the information they're providing as reliable, and therefore ignore those factors in assessing and diagnosing conditions. There's a significant workforce shortage, so we have less experts with geriatric mental health expertise to bring to the table. Homelessness may impact a great deal in terms of being a social determinant of health. As we know, people who are homeless tend to have less and less capacity and ability to address conditions that are treatable, and therefore those conditions can deteriorate a lot faster in people who may not have that kind of age-related perception. Loneliness and isolation. Those emotional elements can have such a significant impact on one's sense of wellness, health, and therefore impact your mental health. What is also important to look at is some of the positive social determinants of health for older adults. As we know, older adults have acquired, in many instances, a great deal of wisdom, resilience, have oftentimes reached that point where there's a clearer picture of what's meaningful in their lives, and may have found the path to better community integration and community engagement in some point. They have oftentimes, more of a clear and definitive community that surrounds them. So there's a great deal of social determinants, and some of them are really associated with those negative terms. Some are associated with positive elements. So it's important to know them across the board. There's a number of risk factors that really impact mental health of older adults. Stressors specific to aging, particularly grief and loss. A lot of older adults have lost their partners, have lost their loved ones, may actually be in a situation where they don't have the social support, the robust social supports as to when they were younger, because their kids or their loved ones have moved away. They may not be able to have that kind of portability because of economic status. So lots of older folks may be in more isolated situations. Reduced mobility, chronic pain, fragility may impact one's sense of purpose and meaning in life. Socioeconomic status can change access to a number of things: treatment, company, access to transportation. Lots of other areas may be impacted. And these all can result in isolation and loneliness and psychological distress, which certainly creates greater vulnerability to mental illness. So we must clearly have a good definitive way of seeing how those variables connect and the path that it takes in terms of creating risk factors. What we do know that while negative views of aging continue to permeate the beliefs of many, there's lots of positive views that have emerged in recent years. They've actually defined successful aging. There is such a thing as successful aging, in contrast to the usual aging. And it speaks to the low probability of disease, high cognitive and physical functioning, active engagement with life. Others have also included wisdom as a characteristic of positive aging. And I always, when I think of positive aging, this is the picture that always comes to mind for me. Keeps me grounded. Tina has a way of making aging look good. Absolutely, Daniel. It's hard to accept aging. And particularly when they come with disease and illness and chronic conditions. Aging is not easy, but you can do it well with good supports and foundation. What we know is that there's lots that impacts even in your best effort to live a meaningful, successful aging life. Ageism, bias, stereotypes, and the impact on valued life roles. So there's lots of battles to be fought. Unfortunately, when you have the least amount of energy and resilience. But doesn't mean that there isn't a path to it. What we learn as well is that older adults become more and more marginalized because of social isolation and so forth, and how they're perceived, all the discriminatory elements. And that can shrink your world. Social roles and mental health roles, losses and gains can impact emotional well-being. So people at a certain age, as we know, as they get older, hold less and less of those important social roles, or those valued social roles. And people, older adults with SMI, have a greater loss of those social roles, right? People don't even think of them as significant, substantial, contributing members of society. So aging plus severe mental illness can actually double your marginalization. So it can put you further and further into the abyss if you're not very careful and conscientious and really able to access supports. Because as we know, in general, older adults already have limited valued roles. Add mental illness to that, it just compounds it. It doubles that impact. So what's important for us as a support entity, as a way of assisting, is to ensure that we're focused on promoting and sustaining valued life roles for older adults, particularly those with mental illness. Assist and support that person in functioning in their role as a grandparent, as a wise old head that you can actually seek advice and guidance from, right? As a source of teaching you about resilience. As a great resource for how to transition through the phases of life, how to face insurmountable odds, all the things that we can learn from our older folks. We can actually encourage and promote their active involvement in those valued social roles. So we must endorse valued social roles for our elderly clients. We must think system over symptoms. What roles do they want to hold? Family member, neighbor, even a resident of a long-term care or a nursing home is still significant. How do they define those roles? What meaning does those roles have in their life? How does those roles impact their sense of gains or loss? What kind of reciprocity they want in those roles? How does their community impact their roles? Are you recognized as a person that is actually capable and have a right to a meaningful life? So we need to recognize how these roles impact our clients, how they relate to our clients. Analyze certainly how the settings that they live in, oftentimes those supported settings, impact their ability to enact social roles, right? Don't just assume because all of the older folks live in the same complex, they should automatically figure out how to engage socially. Sometimes we need to create clear and definitive social avenues for them to access. We know about older adults and homelessness and its impact. What we want to make sure that we focus on is that services and supports really address those SMI and older adults. We want to prepare to meet the specific needs of the older population, right? Train our staff, provide services of support to older adults. We want to develop age-friendly and specific settings and circumstances for the folks we serve. We want to make sure that those who we know are significantly isolated, we actually bring or take them to the social elements so that they can engage actively. And sometimes we need to help them sharpen their skills to re-engage in the social element, not just assume because they don't want to or they don't ask for it, it doesn't mean they want it. Sometimes those questions need to be asked. We need to look at the risk and contributing factor to elder abuse and make sure we're doing the preventative work in that area. So what are the best practices? There's a number of recommendations. The National Council on Aging's 6th Annual Older Adult Mental Health Awareness Day Symposium presented these recommendations. Strategies to improve quality, capacity, and equity. Build and sustain comprehensive programs to support overall well-being of our older adults. We also want to identify and prioritize actions to support family caregivers, as we know how critical they are to our older adults. I want to spend some time quickly on positive psychiatry of aging. It's a very significant element in the whole phase. Because positive psychiatry really shifts the focus, particularly of geriatric mental health care, beyond studying just the disorder and pathology. We want to take a look at studying factors that contribute to mental well-being and successful aging. Interventions that target social connectiveness, meaning in life, wisdom, and resilience can improve overall well-being and other positive health outcomes among older adults. So it's important to evaluate the social determinants of mental illness in older adults, particularly loneliness, social isolation, and to use these interventions to target patients at the individual and the systemic level. So there's a framework to address this, not simply by addressing this psychopathy or the pathology of this. We want to look at it from a social element as well. So there's a number of very specific and effective interventions that has been shown by evidence to be very effective in supporting SMI in older adults. Skills training, we're talking about evidence-based practices, psychotherapy, intensive case management, illness management and recovery, integrated care, where we have the primary care and the behavioral health working concomitantly, working together, working collaboratively to support the whole person. We talk about psychiatric collaborative care, which is really that collaborative work that is done to promote that whole being and address the whole being. Peer support is critical and important to address not only loneliness and social isolation, but to have a voice and an engagement with like-minded folks, people who are sharing similar stuff. It is not only people with substance use disorder that can benefit from peer support. Or we found that the older adults with mental illness can benefit just as much or even more from that social support for many other reasons. We also need to pay particular attention and care to interventions for family caregivers. We need to support the whole system. So we talk about the importance of ensuring an integrated behavioral health and primary care for the benefits of our older adults. What's important here in our engagement, just our interpersonal engagement is critical. And we want as supervisors and leaders to ensure that our staff are honoring and adhering to these guidance and principles. Provide guidance and advanced caring planning for clients and caregivers. We need to build service plans that are reflective of the whole system where that person belongs to. We want to accommodate for the impact of dementia, language, and hearing barriers when we're engaging with older adults. We want to avoid confusing medical terminology. Be simple and basic. You don't have to demonstrate or try to show that you're the expert. All you want is to be understood. It's not about you looking fabulous when you're communicating with older adults, particularly those with mental illness. We want to consider using non-clinical language. Instead of saying, are you depressed? How about you feeling sad? It may simply be sadness instead of depressed. Clearly explain medication and treatment options. Repeat when necessary. Thoughtfully, compassionately, empathically, with an objective of being understood. It's not a test or interrogation. Empower and promote self-management and communicate positive views of aging. If you are not communicating positive views of aging, it may be very difficult for that person to see themselves in a positive light. Speak to that person's wisdom and resilience and knowledge and capacity. Recognize sensory changes that occur with aging. Don't demonize it, but recognize it. There may be diminished peripheral vision. So step in front of that person, speak to that person directly. You know, I remember my grandfather speak on my good side. This is my good side because this is the side that he has best hearing. So make sure you're in that direction when you're speaking. It's important to recognize those nuances. And yes, look at it holistically. It's a person, the whole person we're treating and we're supporting and we're providing for. I think this is a great way to wrap it up, in a sense that in the end, it's not the years in your life that counts. It's the life in your years that count, says Abraham Lincoln. And I always want to remind folks that we all are going to get old. The more aware, conscious, skilled, trained we are in supporting our older consumers with mental illness, the better we become at taking care of ourselves, taking care of our society, and impacting our whole population. Because the better the outcomes are for older adults with mental illness, the better the outcomes are for every citizen in the United States of America. I'm going to wrap up and I'm going to ask if you can take a moment to complete the survey. We are doing a general survey across all our learning communities for Washington State. We want to get a sense as to how they're impacting your day-to-day service, how they're impacting your scope of understanding and learning and readiness to provide the best level of care and services to your population. Please take a moment to provide us with that feedback. It's important. I want to thank you. We appreciate your time and attention and participation in today's webinar. It's hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. We'd like to remind you that the slides and the link to the recording of this session and a wealth of other resources will be available to you in a follow-up email. Don't forget to check out Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all things FSC and upcoming training events. I want to thank you sincerely and wish you the very best of the rest of the evening. There's a number of resources for older adults that are going to also be in the PDF that's going to be sent to you. And as usual, as always, I have thoroughly enjoyed the time with you, and I look forward to our next opportunity to engage in the learning community, particularly for supervisors and leaders. I think we bring a great deal to the table in terms of how we shape the workforce, how we shape the service, and how we can impact by emulation and guidance our supervisors and the people that we lead. So keep doing the great work that you do. I want to thank you once again. And I'll stay on for a minute or two if you have any questions. But other than that, have a great rest of the evening.